Hello, I'm Diane Hirschberg, and I'm the Interim Director of ISER. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the kickoff event celebrating ISER's 60th year. Tonight, we're holding the first of several events that we are planning in commemoration of this anniversary, and we're hoping that sooner than later, some of these can be in person, including in Juneau as well as in Anchorage next spring. So for those who don't know, ISER was established by the legislature in 1961 in an act stating the University of Alaska is authorized to establish a business, economics, and public administration research program for the purpose of developing and publishing statistics and other information regarding the economy, government, and resources of the state. The official date of approval was April 13th, 1961. And as of April 14th, ISER, or at that time, the Institute of Social, Economic, and Governmental Research, was founded. ISER is an interdisciplinary research institute. We have researchers looking at policy issues in the fields of health, natural resources, education, energy, Arctic sustainability, and so on. But from early on, a significant focus has been regional economics and fiscal policy issues in Alaska. Tonight, we are highlighting that area in particular, sharing overviews of and findings from research conducted on the permanent fund dividend over the past few decades, as well as new work being done by the next generation of ISER researchers. I hope that you do find this discussion informative and stimulating, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. So it is my pleasure now to turn the reins over to Pat Pitney, President of the University of Alaska System, to moderate this discussion. We asked President Pitney to facilitate not only because of her longstanding support of ISER across her many roles within the University of Alaska, but also because of her expertise on state fiscal policy, from her work as the state's director of the Division of Legislative Finance, and from before that as the state budget director in the administration of former Governor Bill Walker. So thank you, and take it away, Pat.
Thank you so much. I was reflecting on my introduction to ISER. It was in 1991 when I started with the University of Alaska System Office. And so it's precisely half the time of ISER's involvement. And I have used ISER in so many different modes, from understanding the workforce needs that our state will have, understanding the economics, and then most recently when I was working as the state budget director, the fiscal impacts and the individual impacts of the dividend, the state impact of utilizing the earnings from the permanent fund in a different way than we have in the past. And the value of ISER researchers is they're nonpartisan. They come at it from an economics point of view, but they look at it from a state perspective, a community perspective, an industry perspective, an individual perspective. And having those different views makes a big difference in the quality of decisions that we can make with that information. And I am so excited to have this group of people, our panelists, distinguished panelists involved for our discussion tonight on the issue of the permanent fund dividend program, the percent of market value approach with the permanent fund earnings, and kind of the politics and stalemate we find our state in as a result. Tonight, we'll spend about the first hour on background, starting with the origination of the dividend program and the fund as in whole, and leading all the way up to more kind of the political decisions that we face and the impact of those decisions going forward. So the last 20 to 30 minutes we'll spend in a panel discussion informed by this background. So I appreciate your attention. I appreciate the panelists. And with that, I'm going to start off with Fran Ulmer. So I've known Fran actually since she was Lieutenant Governor. And at the time I was the budget director for the University of Alaska system. And we interacted on, I think most importantly on technology and broadband at that time. And that was some really exciting times on figuring out solutions to the complexities when I think oil was about $9 a barrel. And it was a difficult time then as well. But Fran served as chancellor for UAA from 2007 to 2011. And from 2004 to 2007 as distinguished visiting professor of public policy and the director of ISER. And Fran and I worked many hours together when she was in that role. Earlier in her career, she worked as the legal counsel to the Alaska legislature, legislative assistant to Governor Jay Hammond, and director of policy development for Alaska. In that role, she was part of a team that drafted the original version of the permanent fund dividend, as well as the revised concept that became the current version. This being on the ground, I mean, that's the best thing about Alaska, is that the people on the ground making the decisions that seemed so long ago, we can reach out and touch and talk to. So looking forward to hearing from you, Fran, and then as we go through, we'll introduce the rest of the panelists.
Thank you so much, Pat, for the introduction, and thank you for your leadership at the university. And I am pleased to have the opportunity to join this wonderful group to talk about the permanent fund dividend. I was asked to talk about the history of the dividend, and I would just have to say you can't really understand the history of the dividend without understanding the history of the permanent fund. So I'm going to briefly start there because I think it's important in terms of the context of this discussion tonight. So I'm going to ask you to time travel with me for a moment back to the early 1970s, when Alaska had a whole lot of decisions to be made. The Alaska settlement with Alaska Natives, yes, Congress had just passed that. Congress had just passed the right-of-way for the pipeline in 1971. And we had just received money for the initial payment, so to speak, on Prudhoe Bay of $900 million. And people were really looking toward the future, but also a little uncertain about what that future might look like. You know, I mean, how much money is it going to be and how long is it going to last? And I will have to say that at that time, I know this is hard to believe, the prediction was that Prudhoe Bay would be, yes, an elephant field, but a limited life field, that it actually would only last about 20 or 30 years. And then that would be that. And so the money would stop. I know that's hard to believe now because of the technology that has evolved and the other fields that have helped to supplement Prudhoe Bay, but that's how it was. So the conversation that was taking place in the legislature in the early 70s was, well, yes, we're about to get a ton of money, which is great because we've got lots of things to build like schools and roads and health centers, but it's going to be gone. And we need to think about that and maybe save some of it. So a lot of discussion about how to save, and legislators decided, let's pass a bill to create a permanent fund. And that is exactly what they did. Hugh Malone and Clark Greening and Terry Gardner and Oral Freeman and many legislators really leaned into that concept. The bill passed. I was in the governor's office the day that Jay Hammond vetoed that bill, which was extremely painful for him because he supported the idea, but he had received an opinion from his attorney general that it was unconstitutional. Alaska's constitution does not allow for dedicated funds. So he had to veto it. Well, you can imagine that very quickly transitioned into a discussion about we need a constitutional amendment to create this permanent fund. And that's what happened. But what's really interesting, and I've got to include this section of the history, before the people of Alaska were asked to vote on it in 1976, Jay Hammond asked us to create something called the Alaska Public Forum. And the Alaska Public Forum was basically a community meeting series all across Alaska to ask Alaskans, what do you want for the future of the state? And what should we do with this money? And out of those discussions, a lot of support emerged for this idea of saving some of the money for the future, not having everything get spent right away, but having something when oil stopped to continue to supply things like education and healthcare and roads and ferries. And so that support, yeah, it manifested. 2-1 was the vote supporting the creation of the permanent fund. Well, the permanent fund's creation in 1976 just began a whole lot of other conversations. So then the legislature had to decide, how should we manage the fund? That was very controversial. Some people wanted a development bank, sort of like a venture capital fund where, you know, you'd invest in things that would create jobs, that would build new industries, that would build new infrastructure. The other idea was a much more conservative, let's have a trust fund that is mostly focused on protecting the value of the fund and growing the opportunity for income off the fund. That was led largely by Hugh Malone. And in that picture you saw of me standing next to the governor, I was the only woman right there next to him. Hugh Malone was the leader of the investment trust fund idea, and that's what passed. And for quite a few years, that's exactly how the permanent fund was managed, conservatively. Next conversation, how about sharing some of that money with people? Jay Hammond had a similar idea when he was mayor of the Bristol Bay Borough. He had something called Bristol Inc. that he couldn't get through, but it was a fish tax and the ability to share some back to residents, same kind of concept. So we ended up drafting something called Alaska Inc., a bill that would basically create a fund. The idea was that each individual would get shares of stock based on how many years they lived here. So if you lived in Alaska for 50 years, you'd get 50 shares. If you only lived here for 2 years, you'd get two shares. That was Jay Hammond's idea about how to give some benefits to the old timers who were here building the state way before statehood. And it also had what he thought would be the benefit of not attracting a whole lot of people to just come up for the money. Well, Alaska Inc. passed, and it was challenged by Ron Zobel in a constitutional challenge, which the Alaska Supreme Court said, yeah, it's constitutional. The US Supreme Court said, no, it's not. So Alaska Inc. got thrown out, and it's back to the drawing boards. And the drawing boards then came up with the concept which we have basically now, which is everybody gets the same amount. Every man, woman, and child gets a dividend. But I might note there was a lot of debate about that too, because there were quite a few people who thought children should not get it, just adults, and children would get an amount, but it would go into a savings account. And when the child reached age 18, they'd get the full amount. Well, that was too complicated. So we just went with the everybody gets the same amount, including children. Okay, so there's the permanent fund. And yes, the permanent fund dividend. And yes, at every step along the way, there was controversy. And at every step along the way, I would have to say the competing values were short-term gain versus long-term benefit for future generations. And I will just close this section of our panel by saying, you know, both of the early framers in the legislature, as well as Governor Hammond, as well as I would say most Alaskans who were involved in this discussion, were really interested in something we call intergenerational equity. That notion that just one small number of people in a small period of time shouldn't get all of the benefit of this one-time only natural resource, that it should be extended long into the future for others as well. I would also say that Jay certainly had in his mind that giving everybody a small slice of the action would mean that people would be more inclined to protect the fund itself from possibly just using the whole thing once oil actually ran out. That was important to him as well. And he felt a dividend would help create a constituency to actually encourage wise management and long-term views of maintaining the permanent fund. Well, some would say that worked too well, but perhaps that gets to another topic. And let me just say in closing in my section, aren't we fortunate as a state that these early framers had these ideas, were willing to debate out all the different ideas that were on the table, and end up with a gigantic permanent fund that most other states would love to have, and an opportunity to benefit both current and future generations. Back to you, Pat.
Thank you so much, Fran, for framing that history. We're going to move on to Scott Goldsmith, and he's going to talk about the economic impacts of the permanent fund dividend. And so Scott Goldsmith is a faculty member at ISER from 1975 to 2013, and director from 2001 to 2005. And I've got to say, we really had to twist his arm to be director. And I'm so happy that he chose to do that. And I remember the three-legged finance stools that how Scott explained our dependence on the federal government and on oil and on government in general, and then the rest of the industry. And it was very informative and in a simple way to explain how our economy moved. But he's constructed several Alaska economic models that are regularly used for policy analysis and projections even to this day. He began studying the dividend program in 1984 and has since authored many reports on aspects of the dividend and presented results of his research in publications and international conferences. And with that, Scott, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Can you hear me? There we go. Hi. I'm going to try to frame my answer by dividing it into 5 different time periods, since the research we've done at ISER has tended to respond to different concerns arising at different times about the dividend. The first period was when the dividend was established in 1982. Legislators were skeptical. Would Alaskans waste their dividend on alcohol or trips to Hawaii? Would they stop working? Wouldn't it be better to spend the money on infrastructure rather than just giving it out? Well, ISER answered these questions. In an ISER survey, Alaskans overwhelmingly supported the dividend. Only 10% thought that the dividend was a bad idea, quickly silencing the critics. And the impact of the dividend on household income was dramatic, particularly at the lower end of the income distribution, where for about 20% of the population, it resulted in an increase of more than 20% in their incomes. For about 50%, the increase was from 5 to 20%. And at the upper end, about 35% of the population saw less than a 5% increase in their total income as a result of the dividend. Well, the impact obviously was greater in poor regions of the state, and particularly in rural communities and households in rural Alaska. Alaskans didn't waste their dividends, but they used it to pay off dividends, to pay off debt, to make special purchases. About 10% made special purchases, according to what they said. About half spent the dividend on day-to-day expenditures. About 20% saved the dividend, and about 20% of the dividend went to the federal government as taxes. Well, people didn't stop working by dropping out of the labor market as a result of the dividend. And interestingly, the dividends that went to children were apparently spent according to what the parents said about half of the time, and about half of the time, either what the children alone spent, what the children alone thought, or the decisions were made in conjunction between the children and the parents together. The parents, of course, were somewhat more likely to think that their children's dividends should be saved. And the spending from the infusion of income generated new jobs and income for the overall economy. The population did increase as a result of the larger economy, but people in general were not attracted to Alaska just to get the dividend. Papa Pilgrim and his 16-person family notwithstanding. Well, phase two occurred a few short years later when the oil price crashed and state government looked for a way to fill a hole in the budget and forestall a major recession caused by a drop in public spending. ISER looked at the alternative ways to solve the dilemma, including not only use of the dividend, but also the imposition of new taxes, like an income tax, and big cuts to the state budget. Choosing the alternative with the least negative impact on the economy was complicated by the large number of possible budget cuts that could be made, and the new tax proposals, each with different effects on jobs and income. The macro effects of the dividend were easier to identify in theory because they depended on a simple set of questions that in theory could be answered. What's the average? Now I'm getting a little into economic jargon here. Average marginal income tax rate. What's the average marginal propensity for households to consume? And what were the parental decisions regarding the children's permanent fund dividends? Well, unfortunately, the quality of the data available at that time to answer these questions was not what one would have hoped. For example, the absence of a personal income tax in Alaska meant that we didn't have a lot of data that we would have liked to have had about personal income and its distribution across households. So the results could not be fine-tuned, but analysis did show that cutting the dividend would do as much, if not more, harm to the economy than imposing an income tax or cutting the budget in ways that did not protect directly government jobs. And that takes us to the third period. The dividend survived the oil price crash, probably due more to its popularity than to any ISER analysis. The third period interest, and in this third period, interest in analyzing the effects of the dividend dropped off. The dividend had proved to be a success, so let's leave it alone. There was also reluctance to study it for fear that someone somewhere might be considering changing its structure. But as the dividend became embedded in the economy, ISER attention began to shift to look at its effects beyond how it was spent and how many jobs it supported. We considered, if not answered, questions such as, do the dividends provide a lump sum that allows low-income households to make purchases of big ticket items that they otherwise would not be able to do? Does the dividend represent diversification of the sources of basic income coming into the economy and thus contributing to its stability? Would a monthly rather than an annual payment provide more benefit to low-income households? To what extent are the actual changes in consumer behavior associated with the dividend the same as those that are reported by recipients? Does a big dividend put downward pressure on the wage rate, thus wiping out some of the income gains from the receipt of a dividend by households? Does the dividend reduce poverty? Does the dividend flatten the income distribution? Are there long-term impacts from a continuous dividend payment over many years? In other words, would a behavioral change in people show up only after many years? And I have to say that I was a bit curious about this. So yesterday I did a little calculation. If I had invested each of the 40 dividends that I have received in a fund that paid 4% rate of return annually, I would today have a nest egg of $104,000. But of course, my nest egg would be bigger because I have a wife who also received 40 dividends. And I have 2 children that also received 40 dividends. So this nest egg has the potential for having grown to $400,000 in income. So the question I ask myself is, did I drop out of the labor market sooner because I had that nest egg? Well, economists outside Alaska also began looking at the dividend at this time, mostly seeking support or refutation of theories about how people spend windfalls or changes in permanent income. And this interest from outside of Alaska has led in the last few years to the 4th period of research on the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, primarily by proponents of UBI. UBI, of course, is universal basic income. This is the idea that giving every citizen an unconditional cash transfer might be the best way to achieve many public policy objectives to enhance the well-being of citizens. Researchers studying UBI and looking to learn about the Alaska dividend experience are less interested in macro effects like how many jobs are created, but rather are concerned with how the income is spent and the income and the impacts on social well-being, on health, on education, on inequality, on crime, and so on. Well, unfortunately, early on in this phase, there was little data to tease out how the permanent fund dividend was influencing these dimensions of well-being. But now, energized by a new batch of younger economists, armed with new data sources and more advanced techniques of teasing out the social impacts of the dividends, ISER has added this dimension to the analysis of the effects of the dividend. We've been contributing to the worldwide debate about the effects and efficacy of universal basic income. We'll hear about some of this research shortly, but first, let me just close with mentioning the fact that we're really entering a 5th period of dividend research, which Fran already alluded to. For several years, we've been in the middle of a debate about how to fund government as oil revenues have declined. The future of the dividend is at the center of that debate. Some would say it's preventing us from reaching a solution. So the question is, what is the role of ISER research in answering that question moving forward? Here are 3 suggestions that I'll throw out just perhaps to get the discussion later on moving. I'm sure we can think of more. First, what should be who we should be bringing the universal basic income research done both by Alaskan economists and those from around the world home to help answer the question, what role can and should dividends play in fostering the economic well-being of Alaskan households? Is the dividend a public policy tool in addition to simply being a cash distribution? Second, we need to ask if there are dividend size thresholds. In other words, would a large enough dividend have impacts, positive or negative, that did not show up with a smaller dividend as we have experienced them in the past? So would a $3,000 or $4,000 dividend get people's attention in a way that a $1,000 dividend would not? And what might the implications of that be? And finally, as Fran has mentioned, it seems clear that the biggest economic effect of the dividend to date has been the $80 billion permanent fund. Does the future of the fund depend on the future of the dividend? And I'll just leave that question for future discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Next, we are talking with Matt Berman, Brett Watson, and Mary Kopriva. And these are our current researchers, and they're taking on new discussions and looking into the universal basic income questions, as well as other impacts that the dividend might have. And so, Gunnar, I won't repeat your introduction when we come to you next, but I will go with a quick introduction for Matt, Brett, and Mary. Matt Berman is a professor of economics at ISER and has been researching social science and public policy issues at ISER since 1981. His primary area of interest include economic organization, social ecological systems, as well as energy and natural resources and public health and safety. Brett Watson, relatively new to ISER, a research assistant professor of economics. His work focuses on how natural resource wealth is created, managed, and distributed both nationally and in the state of Alaska. At ISER, Brett has studied commercial fisheries and the effects of the permanent fund dividend on childhood obesity rates and crime. Mary joined ISER this year as a professor of healthcare economics. Mary works in the field of health and labor economics with a particular focus on questions related to women's and children's health and tribal policies. So with that, I will turn it over to Matt Berman to lead this one off.
Well, hello. So greetings from Girdwood, where I'm living and trying to join this webinar where we have lots of snow and rather limited broadband bandwidth. So I apologize in advance if I cut out and so as I was speaking, it already cut out once. So I apologize in advance if it cuts out. I will have to turn off my video because that might help things. But Mariah has slides up and I'm sure she will follow us. So I would like to start by saying one of the things that ISER has been known for over at least the past 40 years, while I've been here and maybe earlier before I came, is our interest in the census data for Alaska and in particular the quality of the census information, because that's what everybody relies on. In my introduction, Pat lists out all these topics that I have researched, but they all have one thing in common, and that's that they refer to well-being, what human well-being, how to measure it, and what contributes to it. And so I'm very interested in the quality of census data, and went in a little bit of history in most of the data that we use, we rely on for the social and economic characteristics of the people of Alaska comes from the census. And up until 2000, it came from the decennial census long form survey, which was a social and economic questionnaire delivered to a sample of the people who answered, who were counted in the census. And in 2000, the census decided to discontinue that and replace it with the American Community Survey, which is an annual household survey with largely the same questionnaire as the census, but it's a different survey. And so we had a question about whether the data that would be collected from the American Community Survey for Alaska would be as comparable quality to what we relied on. So we had a National Science Foundation grant we got with my colleague Lance Howe in the economics department. And with that grant, I got my security clearance and headed down to a census data center and was able to look at the actual survey returns, which are highly protected in confidentiality, and see exactly what the data showed. And one of the questions was about the permanent fund. So the permanent fund, where was that showing up in the census data? Because we had many years to be able to tell, and is it counted in the census data? And if so, where? And how does it show up? And so we started looking for it, and found, sure enough, every year we could see people reporting permanent fund dividends in various places in the census, and with pretty accurate amounts there. It was just rounded off. But one of the problems is the census has not been asking questions about income of children under age 15. So they get permanent fund dividends in Alaska, as you know. Many of you audience people have children under 15, and you get the permanent fund dividend, and were parents reporting it? And the answer, we checked very carefully, and the answer was almost never. They were not reporting it. And so the census was not actually recording income of children under age 15. And that has a variety of consequences. It underestimates personal income in Alaska, but it particularly underestimates, well, it overestimates poverty, because people income, and especially low income people, is lower than measured. So I have this project that we said, okay, what is the actual effect? Could we actually take out the dividend money that people were reporting, looking at what poverty rates would be, and then add what it looked as if people were eligible to receive, and almost always did receive, regardless of whether the census reported it or not, and how that would affect poverty rates. And so this is one of the products of our permanent fund dividend research. And so on the slide there, you can see, just a quick illustration. The bars are permanent fund dividends, and the red squares are per capita income. And so it shows that, see, in 1980 and 1990, those dots are way higher. They're up to as much as 10 to 15% of personal income. And since 2010, it's down there less than 10%. So dividends, it's not that the dividends have gone down, it's that personal income, per capita income has gone up. These numbers are not adjusted for inflation. It's basically inflation has eroded the value of the dividend. And the blue line below it is special low income population. So rural Alaska Native people, and there you can see sorry, I'd say that backwards. But anyway, the blue line is regular for Alaska Native people. It's where it's much more. It's a higher. It was as much as 15% of per capita income back in the 2000, and now it's down below 10. And so, Mariah, you could advance the next slide, and this shows what the effects are. And you'll see these blue bars. That was what poverty rate should be if people were if the census was counting income from dividends properly. And the green bar is the extra amount that the dividend that the census reported was it was lowering poverty, and the census numbers there are the numbers in the red bars. That's what's reported. And the top level is what poverty rate would be with no dividend. And you can see that poverty in Alaska has been slightly rising, but if without the dividend, it was fairly stable around 11% with no dividend. But the permanent fund dividend back in 2000, it reduced poverty all the way down to 6%. That's a huge change, although the census was only recording a little bit less than half of that amount. And in the last decade, especially since 2011, the dividend has been less able to keep poverty from rising. And just a couple of notes on some special populations, Mariah, if you could advance the next slide, that for rural Alaska Native people where poverty is much higher, you can see that it's, the poverty rate with no dividend would be up to 28% of the population, very, very high rate of poverty. The reported numbers are lower, but with the dividend, if it were properly counted, we've weighed much down further, but it would say it's still rising substantially since 2000, even with the dividend. And next slide, please. Just a couple little things for seniors. You notice it's just for seniors, those poverty rates have been going down, and the permanent fund dividend has contributed to that. But you can see it's much more just seniors are doing better with Social Security, more Alaskans in Social Security, et cetera. And next slide, please. Just very quickly. For children, you can see it's where the poverty rates have really been rising is for children. This is for Alaska Native children, where it's a high percentage. And you can see that a third of Alaska Native children would be living under the poverty line if there were no dividend. And with the dividend, it's down to about 25%, about a quarter. But the Census Bureau is only recording less than half of that. I believe there's one more slide I just wanted to show for another thing about the census. Yeah, the census only defines poverty as family members, related individuals living in the same household. And there are a lot of households that have unmarried partners. You're not legally married, and the census doesn't count their income as part of the family. And if they did, so if they did, with no dividend, it's actually substantially reducing poverty even for these Alaska Native rural families. But again, those blue bars are rising rapidly, and it's showing that the permanent fund dividend is less and less able to reduce poverty than it was in the past. And these numbers stopped in 2015, but since then, there's been very, very little change, and I expect that the 2011 to 15 numbers are going to be very similar to what's happened since. All right, thank you. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Brett Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. For my portion here, what I'd like to do is pick up where Scott left off on that phase 3 of our PFD research, which is how can we use Alaska as a case study to think about questions around universal basic income? And so on the next slide here, it's useful to motivate why we're interested in this question of universal basic income around thinking about big structural changes that have happened to the US economy over the last 20 or 30 years. And two of those big forces are automation and mechanization of the manufacturing sector, and then large increases in global trade, particularly the emergence of China as a large trading partner of the United States. And that's led to big changes in the US economy. So we've seen the hollowing out of the US Rust Belt through this deindustrialization there, and the concentration and rise of urban centers in the United States, where wealth is being increasingly concentrated. And on the next slide, we can see some of the folks that are responsible for some of these forces. Elon Musk, Richard Branson, potentially as a result of maybe some guilt that they feel over these changes, have proposed potentially universal basic income as a solution to some of the problems that are occurring, particularly in rural and former industrial centers in the United States. On the next slide, we can see another famous proponent that has potentially identified policy here around basic income. Hillary Clinton, in her 2016 presidential campaign, thought about including a policy called Alaska for America as a policy platform. She mentions this in her 2017 book, What Happened? And then more recently, and potentially the most famous example of a UBI advocate, is Andrew Yang, who ran for president on the Democratic presidential ticket and would frequently use Alaska and UBI from a national televised debate stage. And a slew of headlines ensued, and I've reproduced a couple of them here. So there's been a lot of attention on Alaska as a potential place that we can learn something about universal basic income as people discuss it as a potential policy on the national level. So a question is kind of, what is universal basic income? What constitutes a UBI? And does Alaska fit that bill? So we tend to think about a couple of specific criteria for universal basic income, and I've listed them here. A couple of the most important features are that it's substantive. Here we're thinking about something that this is the basic part of UBI. Does it constitute enough money to really make a big difference in somebody's life? Andrew Yang's proposal, for example, was that we give $1,000 a month to every adult. Another feature is that they're permanent, meaning that the program's not temporary like the stimulus payments that we might have received this last year as part of COVID relief. People should expect to receive them sort of ongoing and into the future. The payments come in the form of cash, either paper money or cash deposited in a checking account. The universal part is that payments are distributed without regard to socioeconomic status. And then finally, this is the unconditional part. There's no strings attached. You don't have to do anything to get the money, and you don't have to spend the money on anything in particular. It's your money to use as you see fit. So how does this stack up against the Alaska PFD? And is Alaska's PFD a UBI? So it matches up on a couple of these important criteria, but it's potentially missing out on that substantive portion. As Matt said, it's not that the PFD isn't a really important part of a lot of Alaskans' income, but it's not quite that threshold level where it could potentially take somebody from zero income to out of poverty entirely. That would require substantially more cash. There's also two other aspects of universal basic income versus the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend that often get brought up in some conversations. Those are on the next slide here. And those include the timing of the distribution. So some proposals for universal basic income say, oh, let's give the money out monthly, or let's give it out biweekly, kind of like a paycheck. Well, the Alaska PFD is paid out annually, so that makes it a little bit different. And then another important difference is how these payments are financed. So the Alaska PFD, as we know, is financed through taxes and royalties on our natural resource wealth, which Alaskans all share ownership in. Whereas proposals for a universal basic income, they might include resource wealth as one source of financing, but they might also be sourced with more traditional financing mechanisms that we're all more familiar with, like income sales, value-added taxes. But they might also be financed by potentially new forms of taxes like carbon or pollution taxes. All of us have a stake collectively in having clean water and clean air. And so maybe it makes sense to sort of tax pollution into that clean water and clean air, and then for us to get a share of that. And then some folks, particularly in the tech space, talk about the tremendous amount of wealth that's created when all of us upload our data into Facebook and Google and Amazon, essentially for free, allowing them to become some of the most valuable companies in the world. And maybe there's a potential mechanism to take that data wealth that's created and redistribute it among the population. So these are just a few of the distinctions, again, in financing. So if we want to learn something about universal basic income in places where it's been implemented before, the problem is that there's not a lot of places where we've seen large-scale universal and unconditional cash transfer programs. So here's a list of other programs that maybe are unconditional cash, but not universal, maybe universal cash, but not unconditional, maybe target certain segments of the population. But none of them have all these same features that the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend does when we think about potentially implementing a UBI. And so that's why the Alaska Universal Base or the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend represents such a useful and important case study to look at. it's important to think about some of the important features that might be borne out when we think about universal and unconditional cash that are listed in the next slide here. Why might we think that these features about these programs might be different from some of those programs that I listed on the previous slide? When you give out universal cash, it turns out you really lower the administrative cost of the program because you don't have to have a lot of people running around to verify people that are low enough income to participate in the program. Giving money to everybody alleviates that cost. It's not very paternalistic. The government doesn't tell you what to do with your money. It's your money and you can spend it as you see fit. There's no welfare stigma associated with universal and unconditional cash. Programs like food stamps traditionally have really low participation rates. Low because people often don't want to view themselves as being low income enough to qualify for those programs. But when you give money to everybody, it turns out that that problem goes away. Similarly, there are kind of weird incentives that are created with certain welfare programs where you say that the benefit is taken away from you if you make too much money. And so that provides an incentive for people to make a little bit less money than they might otherwise. When you don't take that money away, when people earn a certain amount of money, then there's no incentive for them anymore to make less. On the other hand, though, you're giving money, the trade-offs of these programs are giving money away to a lot of people that may otherwise not need it, people at the top end of the income distribution, and that can lead to really high program costs, which is probably the biggest drawback of these universal cash transfer programs, is they cost a lot of money to dole out. And so these are some of the features that can lead to interesting socioeconomic effects to the dividend. And that's currently some of the work that ISER is doing right now, is to understand how these features of these programs lead to interesting social and economic changes. And Mary's going to talk about some of ISER's recent work on this in the last couple of years, thinking about UBI, and then some of what's up on the frontier for the next couple of years of work. So Mary, why don't you take it from there?
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm hoping to do with my research. But before getting into that, I did want to just briefly kind of outline a little bit of the recent research that's been done that my research will be building on, starting off with kind of what's been done in the health space, since I am a healthcare economist. There's been a handful of recent research that's looked at different health outcomes and how they relate to the PFD. One paper has shown modest but significant increases in birth weight and APGAR scores as a result of the PFD. Work from Brett, my colleague Brett here, and some former ISER economists has also showed that the PFD is associated with a decrease in childhood obesity at age 3. And then finally, a couple of recent working papers have also shown an increase in fertility as a result of the PFD. So overall, this research on health is really focused mostly on children's health and has shown some really promising results. Some other related research that's been looked at again recently has shown some similar effects on labor market outcomes as what Scott mentioned, which is that there doesn't seem to be any kind of dramatic decrease in employment or anything like that as a result of the PFD. There's also been a couple studies that have looked at how the PFD impacts consumption patterns, and the evidence here really suggests that there is some increase in consumption of non-durable goods in those months directly following the PFD. So there does seem to be some changes here in consumption patterns. And then finally, again, another study by Brett here and some other former ISER folks looked at the impacts of the PFD on crime. And what they found there was that there does seem to be a somewhat of an increase in substance abuse incidents directly following the PFD in those first couple weeks after, but there's also a decrease in property crime. And then finally, they also showed in that paper that there doesn't really seem to be any impact that they were able to detect, at least on average violent crime rates. So that kind of sums up a little bit of kind of what's been done recently. As I move into ISER and get started, there's a couple projects that I'm working on, I think getting going on here soon. First project will look at the impact of the PFD on maternal health. As many of you are probably aware, in the past decade, maternal morbidity and mortality rates have both been on the rise in the US. And in Alaska in particular, we have especially high rates of maternal morbidity. One policy that's been proposed, kind of like Brett was mentioning, lots more people are interested in this. And one thing that's been proposed is just trying to give pregnant women more financial support. So by studying the PFD, I'm hoping to kind of help give some guidance on how effective this would be. What I'll be studying specifically is looking at how the timing of the PFD, so how if women get the PFD during their first, second, or third trimester versus not getting a PFD at all during their pregnancy, how that impacts two dimensions of maternal health specifically. First, the pregnancy-related health concerns, so things like anemia or pregnancy-induced hypertension, and then also maternal morbidities at the time of death. These are kind of like the more serious ones right at the time of birth. That would be like excessive bleeding or precipitous labor, eclampsia, things like that. So that's kind of the first project that I'm hoping will expand what we know from the health, from just how it affects children to how it affects mothers as well. The second project that I'm hoping to get off the ground here soon will look at the PFD and how that impacts intimate partner violence. Here in Alaska, I think we all know that this is a particular public health concern here, but beyond that, kind of more broadly, we don't know a lot about how these types of cash transfer programs impact intimate partner violence rates. There's these two kind of opposing forces here. On the one hand, it's possible that this money could provide financial independence so that victims are able to leave abusive partners. On the other hand, though, this could lead to an increase in violence if abusers use violence as a way to gain control over this new resource. So in this research, I'm hoping to be able to disentangle these two a little bit, see which one maybe dominates, and then be able to say something about what those average impacts are on intimate partner violence. Looking beyond these first two research projects, I see a lot of room for more research on the PFD, especially kind of with this motivation that Brett was talking about. Within health, there's kind of two areas that I see as places to kind of go next. First is looking at healthcare usage. Again, especially here in Alaska where healthcare is so expensive, we can really imagine that the PFD would be important for determining how people decide whether or not to get medical care. And then second, given those findings from that crime paper that Brett and colleagues did, I think it's important that we try and push more on understanding how the PFD might affect other risky health behaviors like smoking, drinking, or risky sexual behavior. And then looking even more broadly outside of health, I think there's a few other areas that could use a lot more attention as we think about future research going forward. Things like prices, including like prices for labor, like wages, education, and then also migration, thinking both within Alaska, urban, rural areas, and then in and out of the state, which has been mentioned a little bit, but kind of pushing that a little bit further in the future. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Pat.
Thank you, Mary and Brett and Matt. Introduce Gunnar Knapp, our next background speaker. Gunnar came to Alaska to begin a career as a research economist at ISER, where he worked for 35 years up until 2016. And I don't consider Gunnar retired because if I need anything, I call him anyway. He served as director for ISER from 2014 to 2016. And he also was a reluctant director and very much appreciated him taking on that role. In 1984, he co-authored the first formal analysis of the effects of the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend program. But I think Gunnar is most well known for his tremendous volume of fisheries research in our state. And that entire industry has trusted him as a partner through his entire career. And I thank you for your work at the university and your friendship and your support of the entire economy of the state. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Gunnar, for your talk.
I'm just for old time's sake, it's interesting, like Fran talked about, to realize how long some of us have been thinking about this and studying it. And I happen to save a copy of my first permanent fund dividend check for a nice round $1,000, which I'm reminded was quite a long time ago. Okay, next slide, please. Or first slide, please. Any slide? Okay, great. What I'd like to do in my brief time here is to reflect on the permanent fund dividend and Alaska's fiscal challenge, which we've been facing for a number of years and which we continue to face. It has not gone away. Next slide. Now, I want to start with some basic math we need to always remind ourselves of anytime we talk about Alaska fiscal choices, including dividends. And the two basic pieces of fiscal math are, first, we have to pay for what we spend. And so our revenues plus our net borrowing minus our spending equals our net saving in any given period. And dividends are part of our spending. And so decisions about dividends inevitably affect what's possible with regard to combinations of revenues, savings, and borrowing. And the second basic math is that our current choices about any of these fiscal elements of our finances affect our future options. And in particular, how much we save or draw down our savings affects our future investment earnings, and how much we borrow affects our future debt obligations. Luckily, the borrowing part of this is not too big a deal in Alaska at the moment. Next slide. Now, we face major fiscal choices going forward. And these are all part of our fiscal challenge. How will we make these choices? And I characterize them as annual choices, longer-term choices, and constitutional choices. And I think among the most important of these and most difficult, the annual choices include how much should we spend for government, for public services, for capital spending? How much should we pay out in dividends? And the accompanying question is, how much should we save, add to our savings, or draw down from them? And these are the annual choices that we keep getting hung up on year by year because they're extremely difficult to solve politically. Then we face longer term choices, which we talk about, but they would sort of have longer term implications. And the two major debates relate to oil taxes, should we keep them as they are or change them in some way? And then broad-based taxes, such as potential income tax or sales tax. And now entering the discussion very much are constitutional choices, which are what you might call super long-term choices. Should we constitutionally limit permanent fund earnings draws through a percent of embedding the percent of market value formula in the Constitution? Should we have a dedicated dividend share of permanent fund draws? And or should we also, as has recently been proposed, have other dedicated uses of permanent fund draws, such as for education? So we are facing these kinds of issues. And the most important point that I'd like to say today, and that I would try to say anytime I'm talking about fiscal choices in public, as we debate the future of the PFD, we have to keep in mind that we cannot separate our choices about dividends from these other fiscal choices, because what we do with dividends absolutely and directly affects our options for all the other choices. It's sort of like saying, let's say there's only, the plane is full, right? And now you're going to argue that I belong on the plane. Well, you can't argue that. You can't argue whether I get a seat on the plane based on just the question of how much I deserve to be on that plane. But you also have to sort of say, well, who will get off the plane? The second point I would say is that good choices depend upon the circumstances. And choices, fiscal policy choices depend upon the circumstances. And good choices, either as a person or as a state, when you're rich, aren't necessarily good choices when you're not as rich. And the arguments for dividends that applied when we had enormous oil income may not necessarily still apply because these circumstances are different. Next slide. So I think that it's really important as we think about all these fiscal choices, including the dividend fiscal choices, that we think about, well, how did we get here? How did we get to our current situation? And it's useful to remember that before Alaska's had its oil wealth, before that 1971 period that Fran talked about, and continuing about a decade longer, our fiscal choices in Alaska were like most other states. And we paid broad-based taxes, we didn't save large amounts for the future, and we didn't pay dividends. But huge North Slope oil income allowed us to greatly increase government spending, stop paying broad-based taxes, save very large funds amounts in the permanent fund and other funds, and pay dividends. That huge North Slope income allowed us to do all that. And the question is, as the North Slope oil income declines and is not fully replaced by permanent fund income, how will those choices change? Now, I want to show you 4 slides that are full of an incredible amount of data and historical interest, but are also extremely complex and difficult to understand, without taking an hour to explain them. So I'm going to kind of rush through them, but I'm just going to try to use them to emphasize a few points. What I want to do is show you some trends in Alaska's revenues and spending since statehood. And they help to understand how we got here with the dividend and our other fiscal choices. And to make them the numbers comparable over such a long period of time, I've adjusted them for changes in population and for inflation. So all the numbers are expressed in 2021 dollars per capita. The value, what things equate to in current dollars per person. Now, this first slide shows you state revenues per capita in dollars per person. And what you can see is that they were much, much smaller prior to the start of oil production, North Slope oil production in FY78, except for a huge infusion of income in FY70 following the Prudhoe Bay oil lease sale. But then once the North Slope oil production began, and furthermore, oil was, while we had oil income prior to the North Slope, it was a relatively small share of our total income. We had a significant income from a personal income tax shown in the light blue, and we had income from a variety of other sources such as fish taxes and motor fuel taxes and so on. But the picture changed drastically in the early 80s when we had this enormous amount of oil income flow in. And that oil income has gone through 2 giant booms and busts. After the huge amounts of oil income in the early 80s, it declined drastically over almost a 20-year period. And then we had another oil boom in the 2000s, but since then that has also declined drastically. But finally, we had a second source of income begin to appear, beginning in the early 80s and growing ever since, and that was permanent fund earnings. Now, I want to emphasize that when I talk about permanent fund earnings here, I'm talking about realized income of the permanent fund. And for a long time, that was in effect a restricted fund, which was used only for paying dividends and which was not available to general government. But in reality, it was part of the state's income. It's just that we were restricting its uses. Next slide. This slide shows what our state government spending was per Alaskans. And you can see it's generally the shape of what our revenues were, and you see the oil revenue booms and busts, and state spending following that. But you see I want to emphasize several important trends. One is that we had very, very high capital spending when our revenue was highest. That's shown by the sort of the light brown. And then when our revenues declined, we would tend to shrink capital spending drastically. Our operating spending, for government operations, also followed the patterns of revenues up and down, but less dramatically. Finally, I won't go into statewide operating spending, but I want to talk about dividends, which began to be paid in the early 80s and have continued ever since. Those dividends were driven by the statutory formula until FY17, when we began to pay dividends significantly below the statutory amount. Next slide. This slide simply puts the information on the other two slides together, and the vertical bars show our sources of income, and the lines show what our government spending was, and what our both for government, and then the brown line at the top, what shows our total spending, including dividends. And what you can see is that there were, for most of this period, if you include the dividend, the permanent fund earnings as part of the state's income, we were actually earning more than our total outlays. But there were a few years when that was not so, particularly in the early FY01 to 03, and also during Pat's happy times as budget director, when we were definitely facing drastic budget deficits any way you looked at them. Finally, last slide, or next slide. This is the one all this is leading up to, because this slide uses the same information, and I try to show what were the critical policy choices that we made over this period of our wealth. So the lines show, the line at the top shows what our total revenues and permanent fund earnings were. And so what were the policy choices we made over time? Well, the first thing we did as we suddenly became very wealthy was we eliminated the individual income tax. The next thing we did was we began to dramatically increase our government spending. The next thing that we did, which is shown by the blue vertical bars, the next thing that we did was we began to save huge amounts in the permanent fund earnings. We began to save huge amounts of money in the permanent fund and other funds. And finally, our last policy choice, which also came early, was we began to pay significant dividends. Okay, so now the question going forward is, how will this graph look in the future? What will our revenues be, and what will our spending be? What will our dividends be? What will our savings be? Keeping in mind that the savings, or potentially withdrawals from savings, as we had in many years, will affect our future investment income. Next slide. This is too detailed a table to go into, but it's basically our current FY22 budget, and it illustrates a typical phenomenon of Alaska policy debates. Going into this fiscal year, we had, partly through paying a permanent fund dividend much lower than the statutory amount, we had even with that, we still were facing a significant deficit. But oil prices have come up quite dramatically during this fiscal year as a result of the rebound from the pandemic, economic rebound. And suddenly oil revenues are high and our deficit has gone away for the moment. But it really hasn't gone away, and our long-term fiscal challenge remains because I would argue oil revenues and investment earnings really aren't likely to stay as high, and some kinds of spending will need to increase. Okay, next slide. Now, until I run out of time, I'd like to use, and Mariah will let me know when that is, I want to simply offer some reflections on our situation as they affect our fiscal choices and the dividend. Oh, Diane says I'm out of time. So maybe having presented that, I'll leave the reflections for anybody curious enough to hunt down this presentation, and we can go on to the next part of our panel, which will allow us to discuss all these policy issues that we now face relating to the dividend and our fiscal situation. Thanks.
That was quick. I was almost going to break in there, Diane, but I'm glad you were able to do that. Thank you to all of the speakers and the background. And I'll turn it over now to Fran. That our time is short on some of the reflections, but I think it's good to reflect on this and understand that we had a policy choice that set up the dividend program to protect the overall permanent fund. And in the years that we've had the dividend program, the interest in it and the value has morphed. And, are we in a point where we're going to make a different conscious policy choice about the dividend and the size going forward? So, Fran, I'll turn it over to you for your reflection and our group discussion.
Thanks, Pat. I know that we've had some really good questions in the chat from the audience as well, and we could probably spend another hour with them and with each other. But I'll just observe that Alaska's Constitution has often been held up as an example of an excellent Constitution for a wide variety of reasons, including that it doesn't have things like a dedicated fund, in the sense that it envisions a very different future than the present, and the present's very different than the past. And so you need a flexible document so that legislators and governors can actually make good decisions based on the facts of that time. The facts of the times in the 1970s and early 80s, as Gunnar points out, radically different than the times we live in now. So how can we express, both as a people and as leaders, the best trade-offs in terms of values about how to fund essential services that make society livable? For me, my list, education, public health, public safety, parks. For other people, other lists. But to have that funding source for a livable society means we have to pay for it somehow. If we think permanent fund dividends are a good thing for our society in Alaska, whether it's a UBI or a PFD, how do we pay for it? And that's the point that I think we ought to all be spending a lot more time thinking about. Not just, is it good to have a permanent fund dividend? Or is it good to have public health? But rather, how do we pay for it? And the trade-offs between an income tax, a sales tax, reducing the dividend, and having something that is more stable, that people can understand even though conditions will change, oil prices will change. And is there value in that for purposes of predicting whether you're a business or a family or an individual? Yes, I would say so. Why has it been so hard for us to make these choices? You know, I was lieutenant governor 20 years ago running for governor, and it was the same story then. People are reluctant to make a choice that they think will disadvantage themselves or their family. So where you sit is where you stand on this issue. So whether it's a UBI, a PFD, or reimposing the income tax, we have put off this decision for a very long time. And as Gunnar has pointed out, maybe we'll get lucky and we can put it off a little bit longer. But that's really not a rational decision-making process based on either history or what we want for our future. So I would just encourage people, citizens, not just those of us participating in this panel, those who are listening and those who really care about the future of Alaska and not just what their current bank account is, to lean into the decision of how do we raise enough money to have a livable society and still hang on to some of the traditions we love, even if it is a smaller permanent fund dividend. So that's my reflection, and I'll back to you, Pat, to see if anybody else wants to weigh in.
Any of our panelists want to chime in here for just a minute?
This is Gunnar. I'll simply, my one observation would be that a fundamental difference between the dividends, you know, when the dividends started versus now is when the dividends started, we could fund them without having them have to be paid for by other people paying taxes. And now it's difficult to envision how you could continue dividends at the level some people would like them to be without people simultaneously paying, some people simultaneously paying taxes in order to make the dividends possible. And that raises de facto becomes a income redistribution policy. That raises huge sort of questions of, is that fair? Is that right? And you can sort of make a fairness argument on each side. I was intrigued that Brett pointed out that most of the UBI proposals do not propose paying UBI out of an income tax. They'd like some sort of magic other source like, carbon dividends or to play the role that oil wealth played in Alaska. So I think this is sort of a central role. Some people are willing to pay taxes, but not if it's going to pay dividends. Other people are, well, anyway, I could go on. I think that's a central confounding part of our current issue.
Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just like to, ask us think about the difference between the way that we as academics, as policy makers, as I would say people from the relatively educated elite among our citizenry, how we think about the permanent fund differently from this is the fund itself, differently from many citizens in the state. The permanent fund is the sovereign wealth fund for the state of Alaska. And the question is it owned by the citizens or is it owned by the state? And I think many people out in Alaska, and I think I'm probably one of them, believes that the permanent fund should be owned by the citizens. And so the dividend is what we get as basically as stockholders. And it's not the state's right to take it away from us. And so if we believe in that way, then it is a requirement for the state to tax the dividend away with income taxes, sales tax, some other kind of taxes, not to trade off transferring, calling the dividend a cash transfer and trade off a cash transfer to citizens versus a spending on public schools. You see, it's a different trade-off, and I think we sometimes lose sight of it, the way that we feel about it often compared to the way many citizens feel about it.
Any closing thoughts? Scott, go ahead. You're on mute though. You're on mute. Still on mute. There you go.
There you go. I would just concur with what Matt said, because it harkens back to what Jay Hammond's vision was for the dividend. It was a distribution of the wealth to citizens of the state independent of means, and it provided them an opportunity to benefit directly from that wealth, recognizing that a lot of the benefits from that wealth were going to the construction industry, to government employees, government contractors, and so on and so forth, that to a large extent were leaving out many of the citizens of the state. And so I think it's important to recognize that. And I guess I'm sort of coming around to the notion that maybe the dividend should be in the Constitution to remind people that that's what the original notion of the permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend were, established by our founding fathers. Now, I have a real difficulty trying to figure out, not being a lawyer or a politician, exactly what that language should look like. But I think, it's sort of like the Second Amendment issue. What were the founding fathers really trying to say? But I think it also gets back to what Gunnar was saying, that we need to recognize that is explicitly then an income distribution issue. And we need to look at that as public policy analysts and recognize, first of all, recognize that it's happening. And secondly, perhaps make recommendations about whether we think that's appropriate.
All right. Actually, I'm sorry, Brett, we're out of time. But thank you again, all the panelists, for this option. And we have questions in the chat, and I'll ask, Diane, can you grab those questions at some point and maybe figure out how we can share the answers if that's appropriate. But thanks everyone for listening, and thank you all for the panels. I do believe it's the broader we explain the choices, the more people who know the background, the more robust the discussions will lead to a decision. And that a decision on this will allow many other policy choices that are good for the state to move forward. And until this question is solved, most policy questions will be unanswered. So I hope this gets solved in the near term. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night,
And thank you, Pat.
Thank you, everybody.